He said it out loud, in front of cameras, at the G7 summit in France, standing next to the leaders of the most powerful nations on Earth. Donald Trump looked at reporters and said about the trade deal he personally signed 6 years ago, the deal he called the greatest trade agreement ever achieved, that he would rather see it terminated, that the United States would do better as a country without it, that he prefers it to expire. It's not sticking around. It'll be terminated. In other words, it expires. I prefer that. Those words echoed through every boardroom in Toronto, every farm in Alberta, every auto plant in Windsor and Oshawa. $2.7 trillion in annual trade, millions of jobs, decades of economic integration. And the man who signed the agreement that governs all of it just said in public at the G7 that he prefers it dead. And then Mark Carney walked up to the microphone. And what he said next, 6 words, stopped Washington cold. Stay with me, because this is the most consequential moment in the Canada-US trade war in a year. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly what Trump said, why he said it at this specific moment, what Carney's 6 words actually mean, and why the most dangerous thing Carney could have done was exactly what he didn't do. Let's start at the G7 summit in Évian-les-Bains, France, because the setting matters. This was not a random press conference. This was the G7, the gathering of the 7 largest democratic economies on Earth. Canada is one of those 7, and for the first time since the trade war began, Trump and Carney were in the same room at the same table for a working lunch. Carney had been working the room all week. He had arrived in Europe already making 9 separate trips to the continent in the 15 months since he became Prime Minister. He met with the Irish Taoiseach. He laid groundwork with European trade counterparts. He positioned Canada as the reliable North American partner that the world could count on, the implicit contrast with the United States being too obvious to need stating. And then Trump sat down at that G7 table and said what he said about CUSMA. Now, here's what you need to understand about the timing. Trump has been saying things like this about CUSMA for months. He has called it unfair. He has said the United States doesn't need anything Canada has. He has questioned whether it was worth keeping. None of that is new. What makes the G7 statement different is the specificity and the setting. By saying it at the G7 in front of the leaders of Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Japan, and Italy, as well as Canada, Trump was sending a message not just to Carney, but to every other world leader in that room about how he views trade agreements in general. He was saying, I signed these things and I still don't like them. I will walk away from them if I choose. No agreement with me is permanent. That message is designed to unsettle, to make every leader at that table, not just Carney, wonder whether their own trade relationships with the United States are secure. It is also, and this is the critical point, a negotiating position, a very specific one. Trump added in the same breath to the same reporters at the same G7, but I may sign it. 3 words that contradict the previous paragraph. I prefer it terminated, but I may sign it. He said both things in the same statement to the same audience. This is not a contradiction. This is the move. This is Donald Trump's documented negotiating strategy, refined over 40 years of real estate deals and trade wars and political campaigns. You say the most extreme thing possible. You make the other side believe the worst-case scenario is real and imminent. And then, when they are sufficiently rattled, you offer a way out at your price. The question is whether Carney is rattled. Reporters rushed to find him. The cameras waited, the microphones extended, and Mark Carney, who was appearing alongside British Columbia Premier David Eby for an infrastructure funding announcement in Vancouver, deliberately keeping a normal schedule, deliberately projecting normalcy, looked at the press and said, "It's no secret the president in recent years has not been the biggest fan of CUSMA or other trade deals." 6 words that did the most damage. It's no secret. Read that again. Not "we are deeply concerned," not "Canada is ready to fight for this deal," not "this is unacceptable," not even a direct response to what Trump said, just "it's no secret." As in, everyone already knows this. This is not news. This is not a crisis. This is Tuesday. Move along. And then he pointed to the U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, Trump's own trade negotiator, who had said publicly that the underlying structure of CUSMA would remain in place through any negotiations. Carney was essentially saying, don't listen to what the president said at the press conference, listen to what his trade representative said in private. Those are the real intentions. Now, is Carney right? Is this strategic calm, or is it dangerous complacency? That question is dividing Canada right now, and it is the central tension that every Canadian business owner, every auto worker, every farmer, every economist is sitting with as July 1st approaches. The critics are loud. Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the conservative opposition, has been relentless. When it emerged that in his phone call with Trump on June 25th, Carney had not directly raised the issue of CUSMA, had not pressed the president on the trade deal, that is, by every measure, the most important economic issue in Canada right now, Poilievre called it shocking. He said Carney promised Canadians he was the man who could handle Trump, the sophisticated former central banker who knew how to negotiate at the highest levels, and what Canadians were getting was a prime minister who called Trump to talk about the Arctic and couldn't bring himself to mention the deal that affects $2.7 trillion in annual trade. Wasn't that his big promise in the last election? Poilievre's team put out publicly.
It's a fair question. Carney won the federal election in March 2025, in large part because Canadians believed he was the adult in the room, the man who had guided economies through financial crises, the man who could stare down Trump and not blink, the man who said, famously at Davos, "I meant what I said," when asked about standing up to American economic pressure. And now, with the most important trade review in a generation coming on July 1st, he spent a call with Trump talking about the Arctic. But here is the counter-argument, and it is a serious one, serious enough that it deserves to be heard fully before you decide which side is right. Mark Carney is not naive. He is one of the most sophisticated economic minds of his generation. Before he was Prime Minister of Canada, he ran 2 of the most important central banks in the world, the Bank of Canada during the 2008 financial crisis and the Bank of England during Brexit. He has sat across from the most powerful financial institutions on earth and made decisions worth trillions of dollars. He does not panic, he does not show his hand, and he does not make demands publicly that he cannot back up privately. His argument, never quite stated this directly, but visible in every strategic decision he has made over the past year, is that Carney knows what CUSMA is actually worth to both sides. He knows that American farmers need it. He knows that American automakers need it. He knows that American steel consumers need it. And he knows that Trump's political position, with inflation at 4.2%, approval ratings below 40%, and midterm elections approaching in November, makes actually destroying CUSMA politically suicidal for the Republican Party. So when Carney doesn't raise CUSMA on a call about the Arctic, it might not be weakness, it might be the chess move of a player who knows he doesn't need to make that move yet. Because the people who need this deal to survive, American farmers, American automakers, American manufacturers, are already making his argument for him, in Washington, every single day. General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis have told the Trump administration that CUSMA is the most vital trade agreement for America's automakers. The National Association of Manufacturers has said it is essential. The American Farm Bureau has backed renewal. These are not liberal advocacy groups. These are the bedrock constituencies of the Republican Party. And they are lobbying against what Trump is saying publicly every day in offices on Capitol Hill. Carney's bet is that those voices are louder than Trump's press conference statements, that what Jameson Greer says in private negotiations, the underlying structure of CUSMA is solid, is more predictive of the outcome than what Trump says in front of cameras at the G7. It might be the right bet. But here is the risk, and this risk is real, and it needs to be said clearly. CUSMA is not actually expiring on July 1st. It's important to understand this because a lot of coverage is getting it wrong. What happens on July 1st is a mandatory review. Under the terms of the agreement, all three countries must sit down and decide whether to extend CUSMA for another 16 years. If they agree to extend, the deal gets a long runway. If they don't agree, if one country signals it doesn't want to extend, the deal moves into a period of annual reviews for the remaining 10 years of its original term. In the annual review scenario, CUSMA remains in force, trade continues, the tariff exemptions that protect the majority of Canadian exports remain in place, but the predictability disappears. Every year becomes a new negotiation. Every year, businesses planning investments that take 3, 5, 10 years to pay off have to do so under a cloud of uncertainty. And there is a third option that nobody wants to say out loud, but that everyone in trade law is thinking about. Any of the three countries can withdraw from CUSMA entirely with 6 months written notice. 6 months from July 1st is January 1st, 2027, right in the middle of the American midterm election campaign season. If Trump serves that notice, if he actually pulls the trigger, the consequences are immediate and severe in a way that no annual review scenario comes close to. Timothy Mayer, professor of international law at Duke University, put it this way. If he were Carney, he would be thinking that Canada might get a better deal in 2029, when Trump may no longer be president, than in 2026, when Trump holds maximum leverage. The strategy of running out the clock is real. The risk of running out the clock is also real. And here is the detail from this week that is not getting enough attention. Canada and the United States have not yet started formal CUSMA negotiations. Mexico and the United States have already scheduled a third round of formal negotiations, set for late July. Mexico has been working for a year to address U.S. trade irritants, restrictions on energy investments, intellectual property rules, agricultural rules. Mexico is engaged at the negotiating table. Canada has been doing something different. Canada has been building what Carney calls a whole-of-government approach. Premiers, ministers, ambassadors, industry advisory councils, all feeding into a national position. Chief Negotiator Janice Charette, Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc, Ambassador Mark Wiseman. The most sophisticated trade negotiation architecture Canada has ever assembled. But the architecture isn't at the table yet.
And Trump, who has said repeatedly that he believes the decisive moment will happen at the leader level, not the negotiator level, keeps signaling that the only conversation that matters is the one between him and Carney directly. "I don't want to meet with him," Trump told reporters on Air Force One, referring to Carney, after the trade talks were canceled in October. "I'm not going to be meeting with him for a long time." That was October. The G7 in June was a thaw of sorts. They sat at the same table. They had, according to Carney, detailed and technical conversations on the sidelines. But a formal bilateral negotiating session has not happened, and July 1st is days away. Mark Wiseman, Canada's ambassador to the United States, said this week at an event in Toronto,
I don't want to suggest this is easy. The irritants, they're real. Some of them are very hard to manage, but maybe I'm old-fashioned. At the end of the day, there's a mutuality of interest that will get us to the right place. Mutuality of interest. That is the phrase Canada keeps coming back to. The idea that what is good for Canadian trade is also good for American business, American workers, American consumers, and that this shared reality will ultimately bring both sides to an agreement. It is a rational argument, supported by data, supported by the statements of American industry groups, supported by every economic model that has looked at what a CUSMA collapse would cost both sides. But here is what keeps trade lawyers and economists awake at night. Trump has done irrational things before. He has imposed tariffs that hurt American consumers. He has started trade fights that cost American businesses. He has made decisions that by conventional economic logic made no sense, and then used the pain those decisions caused as leverage to extract concessions. The pain is the point. That is what makes this moment so genuinely difficult to read. Carney's silence, his shrug, his "it's no secret" might be genius. The refusal to panic, the insistence on normalcy, the deployment of sophisticated back-channel negotiations while keeping a public posture of calm. Or it might be the silence of a man who knows he is not holding the cards he thought he was, a man who promised Canadians he could handle Trump, and who is now discovering that handling Trump means accepting outcomes that look, from the outside, very much like losing. July 1st will begin to tell us which of those two things is true. Here is where we stand. Trump said he wants CUSMA terminated. His own trade representative says the underlying structure is solid. Canada and the U.S. have not started formal negotiations. Mexico has. The July 1st review is in days. Carney has not raised CUSMA directly with Trump on their most recent call. And the most important economic relationship in North American history is, right now, in the hands of two men who have very different ideas about what it is worth. Watch July 1st. Watch whether a joint statement comes out of the trilateral review. Watch Carney's tone in the first press conference after the meeting. And watch the Canadian dollar, because the traders who read 200-page legal documents for a living are pricing this situation in real time, and the loonie does not lie. We will be here, every step, every development, every move. Subscribe to Conflict Lens. On July 1st, we'll tell you exactly what happened and what it means for the next decade of Canadian and American economic life. I'll see you then. Let's talk about what CUSMA actually protects, because when politicians say $2.7 trillion in trade, most people hear a number too big to mean anything. Let me make it concrete. Every single day, not every year, every day, approximately $7 billion in goods cross the border between Canada and the United States. That is more trade in a single day than most countries do in a month. $7 billion every day, rain or shine, through the Windsor-Detroit crossing, through the Peace Bridge, through dozens of checkpoints from British Columbia to New Brunswick.
That trade is cars. The auto industry alone accounts for over $200 billion a year in Canada-US trade. A single vehicle built in a Windsor or Oshawa assembly plant might cross the border 7 times during its assembly. Components going south, sub-assemblies coming north, finished parts going south again before the final vehicle is shipped to a dealership. CUSMA's zero tariff structure makes that possible. A tariff of even 10% on each crossing would make most of those vehicles economically unviable to build. That trade is energy. Canada is the single largest supplier of energy to the United States. Oil from Alberta, natural gas from British Columbia, electricity from Quebec and Ontario. Electricity that right now powers homes and hospitals and factories in New York, Michigan, and Vermont. Trump has threatened to restrict energy imports.
Canada has threatened to cut electricity exports. Neither side has fully pulled that trigger because both sides know the damage would be mutual and immediate. That trade is food. Canadian canola, wheat, beef, and seafood feed American families. American corn, soybeans, and processed food fill Canadian grocery shelves. The agricultural supply chain between the two countries is so integrated that separating it cleanly would take years and cost billions, and the price would be paid at the grocery store. And that trade is people. Hundreds of thousands of Canadians work for American companies. Hundreds of thousands of Americans work in Canadian operations. The border between the two countries is the longest undefended frontier in the world, nearly 9,000 kilometers, and it moves more human beings, more goods, more ideas, more wealth than any other bilateral border relationship on Earth. CUSMA does not create this relationship. The relationship existed long before CUSMA, long before NAFTA, long before any formal trade agreement. What CUSMA does is provide the legal framework that makes the relationship predictable, that allows a manufacturer in Kitchener to sign a 5-year supply contract with a company in Detroit, knowing the tariff environment that will exist when the goods ship, that allows a farmer in Saskatchewan to plant a crop knowing the market conditions that will exist when the harvest comes. Destroy that predictability, not just the trade itself, but the predictability, and the economic damage is immediate, even if the first tariff hasn't changed by a single percentage point. That is what Carney is fighting to protect. Not just a number, not just a deal, the predictability that makes economic planning possible. And that is why his silence, his calm, his "it's no secret" needs to be understood as something more than passivity. Because what Carney is doing in refusing to panic is refusing to let Trump destroy the predictability before the negotiations even begin. If Carney runs to a microphone every time Trump says something alarming about CUSMA, he signals to every Canadian business that the situation is as bad as Trump wants them to believe it is. Investment freezes, hiring stops, expansion plans die, and Canada's negotiating position weakens because a desperate negotiator gives up more than a calm one. Carney is protecting the psychology of Canadian business as much as he is protecting the legal framework of Canadian trade. And in a negotiation this long, this complex, and this consequential, psychology matters. But here is the test that is coming, the test that will determine whether Carney's calm was wisdom or denial. July 1st is not an ending, it is a beginning. The beginning of whatever comes next, annual reviews, formal negotiations, bilateral deals, were something nobody has predicted yet. And what Carney does in the first week after July 1st will reveal more about his actual strategy than anything he has said in the past 6 months. If he moves quickly to formal bilateral negotiations, if Canada comes to the table with specific, concrete concessions on the U.S. grievance list, on dairy, on digital services, on automotive content rules, then the calm of the past year was tactical, a way of preserving leverage until the right moment. If he continues to wait, if July passes into August and formal negotiations still haven't started, while Mexico is already in its 3rd round, then the question Poilievre is asking becomes unavoidable, not as a partisan attack, but as a genuine evaluation of strategy. What is Canada waiting for, and what does waiting cost? Canada's ambassador to the U.S., Mark Wiseman, who has been working the corridors of Washington, talking to American industry groups, building the case for CUSMA renewal with the people who actually vote in American elections, put it as clearly as anyone has. At the end of the day, there's a mutuality of interest that will get us to the right place. He may be right. The mutuality of interest is real. The economic logic is sound. The political incentives are aligned. On paper, both sides should want this deal. But paper logic has not always governed this trade war. And the next 7 days will tell us whether Carney's bet that reason will ultimately prevail, that American self-interest will overcome American posturing, was the right call, or whether the shrug, in the end, cost Canada more than the fight would have. Subscribe to Conflict Lens, because this story is not over. It is just beginning.